At a quiet Sunday dinner, a son calmly looked at his mother and called her a loser in front of the entire family. What he didn't know was that those few words would trigger a decision that would change his life forever. There is a moment that can quietly change the entire shape of a family. Not a shouting match. Not a dramatic scene where everyone storms out of the room. Sometimes it happens with a single sentence spoken across a dinner table, calm enough that at first you almost think you misheard it. That is how this story begins. A Sunday evening. A family dinner. The kind of gathering that is supposed to feel safe, familiar, almost sacred. Plates pass from one hand to another. The low hum of conversation. Children whispering between bites of food while adults talk about ordinary things. And then, without warning, a son looks at his mother and says, "You're a loser." Not during an argument. Not after hours of tension. Just like that. Imagine the silence that follows a sentence like that. Not the loud kind of silence filled with shouting. The other kind. The kind where everyone at the table suddenly stops moving. Where the sound of a fork touching a plate suddenly feels too loud. That was the moment Evelyn Jameson realized something inside her family had been broken for a very long time. I remember the first time I heard this story. I had to stop for a moment and sit with that image. A mother sitting at the dinner table she probably spent years setting, cooking for, cleaning after, and across from her sits the son she raised, calmly calling her a loser in front of the entire family. There are insults people throw at strangers every day. But something about hearing a child speak that way to their own parent carries a different weight. It forces you to ask uncomfortable questions. How does a relationship reach that point? What happens in the years before a moment like that? The small moments, the quiet compromises, the sacrifices that slowly become invisible. And maybe the most difficult question of all is this. At what point does love begin to look like weakness in the eyes of the person receiving it? Hello everyone and welcome to Empathetic Story. This channel exists for people who are curious about the complicated emotional landscapes inside families. Not the perfect versions we sometimes present to the outside world, but the real ones. The ones filled with difficult choices, painful realizations, and sometimes the quiet courage it takes to finally change the role you've been playing for years. Today's story stayed with me long after I first heard it, because it isn't just about conflict between a mother and her son. It's about something deeper and far more common than many people realize. It's about what happens when someone who has spent a lifetime rescuing others finally stops. But before we continue, if you enjoy thoughtful stories that explore human relationships and the difficult lessons hidden inside them, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support truly helps this channel continue sharing stories that invite reflection and understanding. Now let's return to that dinner table. Because the sentence Michael spoke that night didn't just hurt Evelyn. It revealed something that had been quietly growing for years beneath the surface of their family. And once that truth finally appeared in the open, there was no way to pretend everything was still the same. What happened after that dinner would change not only Michael's life, but Evelyn's as well. And it would begin with something many parents struggle to do. She stopped saving him. But to really understand why that sentence at the dinner table mattered so much, we have to step backward for a moment and look at the kind of mother Evelyn had been long before that night. Because stories like this are rarely about a single moment of cruelty. They are about years of quiet patterns that slowly reshape the way people see each other. Evelyn Jameson was not a distant parent. She wasn't the type of mother who believed children should simply figure life out on their own. In fact, if anything, she leaned in the opposite direction. She believed in showing up, in stepping forward when things got difficult, in making sure the people she loved never had to face their worst days alone. After her divorce from Tom nearly 2 decades earlier, life didn't become easier. Anyone who has raised children alone knows that the word independent often sounds admirable from the outside, but inside the reality is a constant balancing act. Work schedules, school events, bills that never stop arriving, and the quiet responsibility of being the one person your children rely on when something goes wrong. Evelyn carried that responsibility with a kind of steady determination. She didn't talk much about sacrifice. She simply made adjustments again and again the way many parents do. And for a long time, it seemed like those adjustments were simply part of the normal rhythm of family life. But Michael's adulthood brought with it a different kind of challenge. It wasn't that he didn't try. At least, that's how Evelyn explained it to herself for years. He moved between sales jobs, always convinced the next opportunity would be the one that finally worked out. Sometimes it did for a while. Other times things unraveled faster than anyone expected. One of the moments that stayed with Evelyn happened 3 years before that dinner. Michael had just lost another job. His savings were gone, his apartment lease was ending, and a mistake behind the wheel had cost him his driver's license for several months. It was one of those periods in life where everything seems to collapse at once. Evelyn met him at a small car dealership on the edge of town. She remembered how different he looked that day compared to the confident young man she had raised. His shoulders were hunched forward, his voice quieter than usual. When he spoke, he held the paperwork like it might fall apart in his hands. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't know what I'm going to do." Anyone listening to this story might wonder why she didn't simply walk away from that moment. But when you've spent years being someone's safety net, walking away doesn't feel like strength. Feels like abandonment. So Evelyn did what she had always done. She helped. She withdrew money from her retirement savings and paid cash for a modest used Camry. When the dealership handed Michael the keys, something unexpected happened. He started crying. Not the quiet tears people sometimes hide. Real, overwhelming emotion that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. He hugged her tightly in the parking lot, repeating the same sentence over and over. "You're saving me, Mom. You're saving me." For Evelyn, that moment meant everything. She even took a photograph of him leaning against the hood of the car, smiling the way he used to smile when he was younger, when the world still felt wide open. She saved the photo in the favorites folder on her phone, the place people reserve for memories they never want to lose. But there's something complicated about rescues. When someone saves you once, gratitude usually follows. When someone saves you again and again, something else can quietly take its place. Dependence. Over time, Evelyn's support continued in different forms. Sometimes it was groceries when money was tight. Sometimes it was help with unexpected bills. Eventually it was the down payment that allowed Michael to move into a small ranch-style house on Sycamore Street. Each time she helped, she told herself the same thing. He just needs a little stability. But stability built entirely on someone else's support can be fragile. Because if the person standing on that support begins to believe it will always be there, the line between generosity and obligation slowly disappears. And by the time Michael sat across from his mother at that dinner table, something inside that relationship had already shifted in a way Evelyn had not fully seen yet. What she thought was love, he had quietly begun to see as something he deserved. And once a relationship quietly shifts from gratitude to entitlement, the truth has a way of revealing itself in moments no one can control. That Sunday dinner was supposed to be simple. Nothing dramatic, nothing ceremonial. Just the familiar rhythm of a family gathering that had happened dozens of times before. Evelyn had spent most of the afternoon preparing the meal the way she always did, moving through the kitchen almost automatically, seasoning the chicken, setting plates, making sure the grandchildren had the foods they liked. These routines may sound small, but anyone who has spent years holding a family together understands how much quiet care lives inside them. Meals like that are rarely just about food. They are about maintaining the fragile idea that, despite everything life throws at people, there is still a place where everyone belongs. When the family finally gathered around the table, the atmosphere seemed ordinary enough. Anna was helping the kids settle down, reminding them to use their inside voices. The smell of roasted chicken filled the room. For a few minutes, the conversation moved through the usual topics: school, work, the weather, the kind of light conversation families used to ease into an evening. But beneath that surface calm, something had already begun to shift. Michael had been unusually quiet. Not the thoughtful kind of quiet, but the restless kind that signals someone carrying irritation they haven't decided how to express yet. Evelyn noticed it the way mothers often notice subtle changes in their children's moods, even when those children are fully grown adults. Still, she said nothing. She passed a bowl of vegetables down the table and tried to keep the conversation moving. Then the moment arrived. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair and looked across the table at her. The look itself wasn't explosive. It wasn't filled with obvious anger. If anything, it carried the casual confidence of someone who felt entirely justified in what he was about to say. "You know what the problem is?" he said. The room quieted. "You've always acted like you're some kind of hero, Mom. Like everything in this family revolves around you." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, trying to understand where the accusation was coming from. Anna reacted first. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice already tightening with disbelief. Michael shrugged, almost amused by the reaction. "You think she's some saint," he said, gesturing toward Evelyn. "But you didn't grow up the way I did after Dad left." It's interesting how quickly people can rewrite history when it serves their emotions in the moment. Years of effort, years of sacrifice, can be reduced to a completely different story when someone decides to frame the past in a new way. Evelyn listened without interrupting. Across the table, Linda sat quietly. She didn't jump into the argument. She didn't correct Michael or attempt to soften the tension. Instead, she watched with the composed expression of someone who was comfortable letting the moment unfold. There's something deeply unsettling about silence like that. Not the silence of shock. The silence of quiet approval. Michael continued speaking, his tone gaining confidence with every sentence. "You made everything harder than it needed to be," he said. "You pushed people away. That's why Dad left in the first place." Anna's fork hit the plate. "How dare you say that?" she snapped. The grandchildren froze, sensing the shift in the room even if they didn't understand the words. Michael rolled his eyes, the gesture of someone who believed he had finally said what needed to be said. Then came the sentence that would echo long after the dinner plates were cleared. "You're a loser, Mom," he said flatly. "Linda is the real mother I never had." For a moment no one moved. Evelyn didn't shout. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she looked at her son the way someone might look at a stranger they suddenly realize they don't recognize anymore. The silence stretched across the table. And in that silence, something inside Evelyn began to shift in a way she couldn't yet fully explain. Because sometimes the most painful thing about betrayal isn't the words themselves. It's the realization that the person speaking them truly believes they are justified. And when someone believes they are justified in hurting you, the silence that follows can reveal more truth than any argument ever could. That night, after the dinner plates were cleared and the house had finally grown quiet, Evelyn found herself lying awake in the dark, staring up at the slow rotation of the ceiling fan above her bed. The rhythm of it was steady, almost hypnotic, but her mind refused to settle. Moments like that have a strange quality to them. The world outside keeps moving exactly the same way it always has. Cars pass in the distance. The refrigerator hums in the kitchen. Somewhere down the street a dog barks once and then goes quiet again. But inside your own thoughts, something fundamental has shifted. Evelyn wasn't replaying the argument in anger. That's what surprised me the most when I first heard this part of the story. Most people imagine that a mother insulted that way would lie awake rehearsing every word she wished she had said. Instead, her mind moved in a completely different direction. She began remembering Michael as a child. Not the man who had just spoken across the dinner table with that cold confidence, but the small boy she had raised through years of ordinary, uncelebrated love. The memories came slowly at first, the way old photographs appear when someone opens a long-closed album. She remembered the afternoon he cried so hard when his pet turtle died that she had to carry him outside just to help him catch his breath. She remembered the way he used to sing loudly in the back seat during long car rides, completely unaware that he was off-key, completely unbothered by it. There was another memory she hadn't thought about in years. A dentist appointment when Michael was 9 years old. He insisted on holding her hand in the waiting room, not because he was afraid, but because he thought she might be. That was the child she had spent decades protecting. But lying there in the dark, Evelyn began to recognize something painful. The boy in those memories and the man who had spoken to her at dinner felt like two entirely different people. For a long time she had told herself that Michael's struggles were temporary. That once life stabilized for him, once the right opportunity appeared, once he found his footing, everything would fall back into place. But that night she allowed herself to ask a question she had quietly avoided for years. What if the pattern wasn't temporary? What if the reason Michael never truly stabilized had something to do with the way she had always stepped in to steady him? It's a difficult thought for any parent to face. Helping your child feels natural. It feels like the most obvious expression of love there is. But help, when given without limits, can sometimes create something unexpected. Dependence. Evelyn began mentally retracing the moments when she had stepped forward to rescue him. Paying for emergencies. covering debts, smoothing over problems that might have forced him to change if he had been left to handle them himself. Each time she acted out of care. Each time she believed she was protecting him. But as she lay there in the quiet darkness, a different possibility started forming in her mind. What if, without meaning to, she had also protected him from the consequences that might have helped him grow? That realization didn't arrive as a burst of anger. It arrived as clarity. A slow, steady understanding that the role she had played in Michael's life for years had quietly changed. She was no longer just his mother. She had become the system that absorbed the impact of every mistake he made. And systems like that can become invisible to the people who rely on them. By the time the first hint of dawn began to lighten the edges of the window, Evelyn had reached a decision that felt both simple and terrifying. She wasn't going to rescue him anymore. Not because she had stopped loving her son, but because she had finally begun to understand that sometimes love requires something far more difficult than sacrifice. Sometimes it requires stepping back and allowing reality to do the teaching you can't do yourself. And once a person reaches that kind of clarity, the next step is rarely loud or dramatic. It is usually quiet, deliberate, and deeply intentional. The following morning began earlier than usual for Evelyn. The sky outside her kitchen window was still a pale gray. The kind of light that appears just before sunrise when the world feels suspended between night and day. She moved through the kitchen slowly, almost thoughtfully, filling the kettle and preparing a cup of coffee the same way she had done thousands of times before. But something about this morning felt different. Not because she was angry. That would have been easier to understand. Anger burns hot but fades quickly. What Evelyn felt instead was something steadier. Resolve. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and opened the drawer beside her. Inside was a thick folder she had been adding documents to over the years. At the time she had never thought of it as anything significant. Just records, receipts, statements, ordinary paperwork people collect as life moves forward. But when she spread the contents across the table that morning, the pattern became unmistakable. Mortgage statements from the house on Sycamore Street. Property tax payments. Insurance records. Maintenance invoices. And then another stack. The vehicle registration for the Camry. Insurance coverage. Service receipts. Every document carried the same name. Evelyn Jameson. For years she had never looked at those papers as evidence of anything beyond responsibility. They simply represented the quiet support she had given her son whenever he needed stability. But that morning she saw them differently. Not as sacrifices, as facts. If you spend enough time observing family dynamics, you eventually notice something people rarely talk about. Emotional relationships often feel complicated and messy, but the structures underneath them can be surprisingly simple. Ownership matters. Responsibility matters. Paper trails matter. Evelyn closed the folder carefully, finished her coffee, and stood up. There was no rush in her movements, no visible tension. The decision she had reached during the night had already settled inside her. The drive across town felt almost peaceful. Early autumn air slipped through the small gap in the car window, cool and sharp against her skin. Leaves along the street had just begun to change colors, their edges turning shades of gold and amber. She turned onto Sycamore Street and slowed as the small ranch-style house came into view. Michael had been so excited the first time he walked through that place. She could still remember his voice echoing slightly in the empty living room, talking about fresh starts and second chances. Now the house sat quietly in the morning light. Evelyn parked along the curb and stepped out of the car, holding the folder under her arm. When she knocked on the front door, it took nearly a full minute before it opened. Michael appeared looking half awake. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. For a moment he simply stared at her, confused by the unexpected visit. "Mom," he said. "What are you doing here?" Evelyn didn't step inside. She extended her hand calmly. "I need the keys." Michael frowned. "What keys?" "The house," she said. "And the car." For a second he looked like he thought she was joking. Then he let out a short laugh. "You're not serious." Evelyn remained still. That stillness seemed to irritate him more than if she had raised her voice. "Mom, you gave me this place," he said, gesturing toward the house behind him. "And the car too." She opened the folder slowly and turned a few pages so he could see. Mortgage statements. Registration documents. Insurance paperwork. All in her name. I paid for them, she said quietly. They were never yours. Across the street, a neighbor walking a dog slowed down slightly. Another person adjusting a sprinkler paused longer than necessary. Michael's voice dropped as he stepped outside. This is insane, he muttered. Evelyn held out her hand again. Keys. For years Michael had believed those things were his because he lived with them every day. But standing there barefoot in his driveway, watching his mother hold the documents that told a different story, he began to understand something he had never considered before. Generosity can look like ownership when you depend on it long enough. And the safety net he had always assumed would remain beneath him was finally being pulled away. And once the illusion of ownership disappeared in that driveway, something else had to follow. Because taking back the keys was only the beginning of what Evelyn had decided to change. What fascinated me most about this part of the story is how quiet the next step was. No confrontación. No shouting. No dramatic declarations. Just paperwork. Later that same morning, Evelyn walked into her local bank carrying the same folder she had shown Michael. The building itself looked exactly the way it always had: glass doors, polished floors, the faint scent of printer ink and paper that every bank seems to carry. It was such an ordinary setting that you could easily miss the significance of what was about to happen inside. And maybe that's the part people often overlook when they talk about life-changing decisions. The turning points are rarely cinematic. They happen at desks, across counters, in calm conversations where someone finally decides to stop continuing a pattern that has existed for years. The receptionist greeted Evelyn with the kind of familiarity that comes from seeing someone regularly. I thought you handled everything online these days, she said with a friendly smile. Evelyn returned the smile. Not today. There was something quietly final about those two words. A few minutes later she was sitting across from a young bank officer named Clara. Clara's desk was tidy, her computer screen glowing softly in front of her. The gold wedding band on her hand caught the overhead light every time she moved the mouse. Clara opened the account records Evelyn had asked to review. So this is the mortgage connected to the Sycamore Street property, she said, glancing at the screen. You've been covering the automatic payments. Yes, Evelyn said calmly. Clara scrolled through the history. Month after month appeared in a neat line of transactions. Thousands of dollars quietly transferred from Evelyn's account to maintain a house someone else lived in. Clara turned slightly toward her. What would you like to change? Evelyn folded her hands together on the desk. I'd like to cancel the automatic payments. Clara paused. Not because the request was unusual. People adjust automatic payments all the time. But something about the context made her hesitate. You understand, Clara said carefully, that once the autopay is canceled, the responsibility for the mortgage shifts entirely to the resident. Evelyn nodded. I understand. Clara looked at the screen again. If payments aren't made, the account will become delinquent. Eventually the property could enter default. Evelyn didn't react to the warning. She had already thought through those possibilities during the long hours of the previous night. What interested me about this moment when I first heard it was not the financial decision itself. It was the emotional shift behind it. For years, Evelyn had acted as a buffer between Michael and reality. Every missed payment, every financial crisis, every unstable job had been softened by her willingness to step in. But buffers have consequences. When someone absorbs every impact for another person, the person being protected never feels the full weight of their own choices. And that morning, Evelyn had decided something simple. She was no longer going to absorb that weight. Clara moved the cursor slowly across her screen. Are you certain you want to proceed? She asked. Evelyn looked at the computer monitor, at the long line of past payments that had quietly supported Michael's life for years. Then she nodded. Yes. The click of the mouse was almost impossibly small. One soft sound. But that single action erased the financial cushion Michael had relied on for so long. The automatic payments were gone. Evelyn gathered her documents, thanked Clara, and walked back outside into the morning light. The sky had fully brightened by then, the street outside the bank already filling with traffic and people moving through their daily routines. It would have looked like any ordinary day. But for Michael, the effects of that quiet decision appeared almost immediately. Evelyn had barely reached her car before her phone began vibrating. Michael's name appeared on the screen. She let it ring for a moment before answering. "Mom!" His voice burst through the speaker. "What did you do?" There was a tension in his tone that hadn't been there before. Not arrogance this time. Not anger. Panic. "I stopped paying," Evelyn said simply. "What do you mean you stopped paying?" he demanded. "The house," she replied. "You live there. You pay for it." His voice rose instantly. "You can't just do that. I've got bills, I've got responsibilities." It's interesting how the language changes when the safety net disappears. For years, those responsibilities had existed quietly behind Evelyn's support. Now they suddenly felt urgent. "You're messing with my life," Michael said. Evelyn sat quietly in the car, listening to the strain in his voice. "No," she answered calmly. "Your life was always yours." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The kind of pause where someone realizes the rules they've been living under have changed. "You've always helped me," Michael said finally. "That's what you do." For a moment, Evelyn looked out through the windshield at the steady flow of cars passing through the intersection. Then she spoke the words that truly defined the shift in their relationship. "That's who I was," she said. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else in the conversation. Because for the first time in his adult life, Michael was standing in a situation his mother wasn't going to fix. And when a safety net disappears after years of being there, the ground underneath can feel very far away. And when the ground finally shifts beneath someone who has relied on support for years, the next voices to appear are often the ones that were quietly influencing things all along. In Evelyn's story, that voice belonged to Linda. If you've ever watched complicated family dynamics unfold, you start to notice certain personalities that rarely raise their voices, but somehow manage to shape the entire atmosphere around them. Linda had always been that kind of presence. She rarely argued openly. She preferred calm sentences, polite smiles, and carefully placed remarks that seemed harmless on the surface but carried a subtle direction underneath. 15 years earlier, she had entered the family as Tom's new wife. Over time she had positioned herself in a role that looked supportive from the outside, but inside the family it created a quiet division. Conversations shifted around her. Opinions often seemed to align with hers without anyone quite noticing how it happened. So it was not surprising that the next call Evelyn received that evening did not come from Michael. It came from Linda. The number appeared on Evelyn's phone just after 9. No long message. Just a short text. "You've made your point. Now step aside." I remember pausing when I first heard that line. There's something revealing about the way people choose their words. Linda didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask for a conversation. Instead, she framed the entire situation as something Evelyn had done wrong that now needed to stop. Step aside. As if Evelyn's role in her own son's life had somehow become an obstacle. Evelyn read the message once, then pressed the call button. Linda answered almost immediately. "Evelyn," she said, her voice carrying that smooth calm she always used. "I assume you realize this situation has gone too far." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "No," she replied, quietly. "I think it's finally gone far enough." There was a pause on the other end. "Michael is humiliated," Linda continued. "He's under a lot of pressure right now. What you're doing is hurting him." That was the moment where the pattern became impossible to ignore. When people manipulate situations, they often do it by shifting the focus. The person who set a boundary becomes the one accused of causing harm. The person who created the problem fades quietly into the background. Evelyn listened without interrupting. "You think abandoning your son makes you strong?" Linda asked. Evelyn's response came slowly. "You don't get to define motherhood for me." For a moment, Linda's carefully maintained tone cracked. "You've always needed control," she said sharply. "Everyone knows that." What interested me most when I heard this exchange was the way Evelyn didn't react emotionally. She didn't defend herself, didn't try to argue point by point. Instead, she introduced something Linda hadn't expected. Calm. Earlier that day, after leaving the bank, Evelyn had visited a lawyer named Laura Klein. Laura had spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents Evelyn brought with her. Mortgage records, vehicle titles, bank statements. Everything connected to Michael's financial stability was legally tied to Evelyn. The situation from a legal perspective was very clear. But during that meeting another detail had surfaced.
Linda's boutique.
A small fashion business she promoted proudly online, presenting herself as a successful entrepreneur. According to Laura's research, the boutique had accumulated significant unpaid tax obligations connected to several questionable expense claims. Nothing publicly exposed yet, but enough to create serious consequences if authorities looked closely. Evelyn didn't raise her voice when she mentioned this. "I think we should both be careful about threats," she said calmly. Linda went silent. Not the polite silence she used during family dinners. A different one. The kind that appears when someone suddenly realizes the person they believed was powerless may actually understand the rules of the game better than they expected. And for the first time in many years, the quiet influence Linda had held over the family no longer felt quite as secure. And once people realize the balance of power around them is shifting, the consequences rarely stay hidden for long. The official notice went out a few days later. It was not dramatic.
No shouting, no confrontation.
Just a legal document prepared by Evelyn's attorney delivered. The way formal things are usually delivered in the real world, by courier, sealed in an envelope that carried far more weight than it seemed at first glance. A 30-day notice to vacate the property on Sycamore Street. For years that small house had existed inside a quiet illusion. Michael lived there, decorated it, spoke about it as if it were the foundation of his independence. To anyone looking from the outside, it probably appeared to be exactly that. But the paperwork told a different story. Ownership had always belonged to Evelyn. And once the legal process began, the illusion could no longer protect him. What fascinates me about moments like this is how quickly private family conflicts can become visible, once they intersect with the outside world. A situation that once lived entirely behind closed doors, suddenly becomes part of a neighborhood's quiet awareness. By Saturday morning, a moving truck had appeared on Sycamore Street. Boxes began stacking up near the front porch. The early autumn air carried that unmistakable feeling of transition, the kind that arrives when something that seemed permanent turns out to have been temporary all along. Neighbors noticed, of course. Suburban streets have their own rhythm of observation. People rarely stare openly, but curiosity travels through small gestures. A woman watering her garden lingered a little longer by the fence. Two teenagers riding bikes slowed down just enough to take a second look. And then there was the notice taped beside the front door. Clear, official language printed across the page. Notice of termination of tenancy. Words like that have a way of transforming an ordinary house into a public story. By the afternoon, pieces of Michael's life had begun appearing along the curb. The couch that Evelyn had helped him buy years earlier sat awkwardly in the sunlight, its fabric faded from use. A few kitchen chairs leaned against each other near the driveway. Boxes filled with dishes and books were stacked beside them. It struck me, hearing this part of the story, how symbolic those objects felt. Every item represented a moment when Evelyn had tried to help her son build stability. Now they sat outside like fragments of a life that had never fully taken root. Evelyn didn't stand in the driveway watching. She parked half a block away and remained inside her car. Not out of shame. Not out of triumph either. Just distance. From where she sat, she could see Michael moving in and out of the house carrying boxes. His movements looked slower than usual. The restless confidence that once defined him replaced by something heavier. Fatigue. At one point he turned toward the street and his eyes found her car. For a moment he stopped. She didn't wave. She didn't lower her gaze. She simply watched. There is something powerful about witnessing consequences without interfering. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm acceptance that the situation unfolding is no longer yours to control. By evening the house looked almost empty. The moving truck had taken most of what it could carry. The rest remained on the curb, waiting for the next step in a process that had already begun. For the first time in many years, Michael was standing in a reality where the systems that once protected him were no longer in place. And sometimes the most important lessons in life begin exactly there. At the moment when the support you once relied on quietly disappears, and you are left alone with the results of your own decisions. And when reality finally replaces the safety net someone has lived on for years, what happens next often reveals who they are willing to become. A couple of weeks passed after the house on Sycamore Street was emptied. The neighborhood moved on the way neighborhoods always do. Lawns were trimmed, packages were delivered. People waved politely from their driveways as if nothing unusual had happened. Life has a remarkable ability to absorb even dramatic events and fold them quietly back into routine. Evelyn didn't spend those weeks discussing what had happened. She didn't explain herself to neighbors or defend her decisions to distant relatives. That was another change that caught my attention when I first heard this story. People who finally establish firm boundaries often stop trying to justify them. They simply live with them. Then another dinner came. This one was organized by Anna, not as a large family gathering but as a small birthday celebration for her youngest daughter. The house felt lighter than the previous dinner had been. Balloons tied to chairs. Children laughing in the kitchen. The soft chaos that always seems to follow birthday cake, and too much excitement. For most of the evening it was exactly the kind of gathering families hope for. Then the door opened. Michael stepped inside. The difference in him was noticeable immediately. Not in any dramatic way but in the small details people often overlook. His posture had changed. The easy confidence he used to carry had softened into something quieter. His clothes looked worn from a few restless weeks, and there was a tiredness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He held a bottle of inexpensive wine in one hand. No speech. No performance. Just an attempt to show up. He greeted Anna first, giving her a quick hug before saying hello to the children. They responded politely but with the cautious distance children sometimes show when they sense complicated emotions between adults. Then his eyes moved across the room and found Evelyn sitting at the dining table helping one of the grandchildren unwrap a toy. She looked up. And something about that moment felt very different from the previous dinner they had shared. The tension that once filled the air wasn't there anymore. Instead there was something calmer. Clearer. Michael walked slowly toward the table. "Mom," he said. Just that one word. For a moment it seemed like he was searching for the rest of the sentence somewhere in the room. Finally he took a breath. "I was wrong." The room grew quiet again, though this time the silence carried a different energy. Evelyn studied his face carefully. Not with anger. Not with the lingering hurt that might have been there weeks earlier. Instead she looked at him the way someone looks at a complicated situation they have already spent a long time thinking about. Then she nodded once. "I know," she said. Michael seemed almost surprised by the response, as if he had expected a different kind of reaction. Maybe forgiveness offered immediately. Maybe a return to the familiar pattern where everything was quickly smoothed over, and life continued as if nothing had changed. But Evelyn didn't move toward that old pattern. Her voice remained calm when she spoke again. "Apologies don't solve the problems that created them," she said gently. "Respect does." Michael didn't argue. He simply stood there for a moment before quietly taking a seat farther down the table. And that's where I think the real transformation in this story becomes visible. For years Evelyn had occupied a background role in her own family. The one who solved problems quietly. The one who stepped forward when things collapsed. The one whose support held everything together but rarely received recognition. But that night the center of gravity in the room had shifted. Not because Evelyn demanded it. Because she finally understood something many people spend their lives learning too late. Love and self-respect are not opposites. Sometimes the strongest expression of love a person can offer is the willingness to step back, allow consequences to unfold, and trust that growth, however painful, can still happen on the other side of them. When I step back and think about Evelyn's journey, what stays with me is not the conflict itself, but the quiet transformation that happened inside her. For years she lived the way many loving parents do, believing that helping again and again was the purest expression of love. Each time her son stumbled she stepped forward. Each time life knocked him down she softened the fall. From the outside it looked like devotion. But over time, something subtle and dangerous had grown beneath that devotion. The line between support and dependence had quietly disappeared. What Evelyn eventually realized is something many people struggle to admit. Love without boundaries can slowly turn into permission. Not because the parent intends it, but because the person receiving that help stops seeing it as a gift. It becomes expected. And once something becomes expected, gratitude quietly fades. Her decision was not about revenge or punishment. It was about restoring balance. She didn't stop loving her son. She simply stopped protecting him from the consequences that every adult must eventually face. In doing so, she rediscovered something powerful about herself. She was no longer the invisible safety net holding everything together. She became a person who understood that dignity, respect, and compassion must also include compassion for yourself. The deeper lesson here is simple but difficult to practice. Helping someone is generous, but helping someone forever can sometimes prevent them from growing. Real love often requires courage, the courage to say no, the courage to step back, and the courage to trust that people must sometimes face their own responsibilities before they can truly change. In our own lives, this lesson can apply to many relationships, family, friendships, even work. Supporting people we care about is important, but so is recognizing when support has quietly become dependence. Healthy relationships are built not only on kindness, but also on clear boundaries. Now I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Evelyn made the right decision by stepping back and letting her son face the consequences of his choices? Please share your perspective in the comments so everyone watching can learn from different viewpoints. And if stories like this help you reflect on life and relationships, please consider subscribing to Empathetic Story. Your support truly helps the channel continue sharing meaningful stories like this in the future.